All right. So good afternoon to everybody. My name's John Palameni. I'm the president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. And today is a continuation of our seminar series that we've been holding for quite a while now. And today's speaker is Lina Correa from York University. But before we start, I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't already done so, please mute your microphones. You can put any questions in the chat if you want, or at the end, there'll be plenty of time to unmute yourselves and ask your own questions. And then just a reminder, October 4th will be our next seminar by Jeroen Vandenberg, followed by a members-only seminar by Stefan Baumgartner from the journal Ecological Economics. And then we have a new series of seminars coming up where we're tentatively calling it Putting the Ecology Back into Economics, where we have a science seminar on a particular topic, such as the oceans, coral reefs, the forests, wetlands, and then that's followed up the following week with an ecological economics seminar to see how we really need to start continuing merging the two together if we're going to make a real effort. So with that, we will introduce our guest. It's Lina Correa, as I said, from York University, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. She's an assistant professor there, and today she will be her talk is titled, I tried to say, Degrowth in a Settler State, Climate Just Economic Transitions and Reconciliation with Indigenous People in Canada. So with that, please welcome our guest, Lina Correa.
Okay, thanks very much, John. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. I wasn't sure kind of who tends to join the US Society for Ecological Economics, so it's nice. It's all sorts of familiar names, but also new names, which is also really good. Okay, let me start sharing my screen. So, can you see my notes section?
No, you're just, yes, actually, we can see your notes.
Okay, let me see. Is that better?
Nope.
Or just the notes still?
We can see both your screen and the notes section.
Okay, let me try this again. Apologies for that. How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So yes, like John said, today I'm going to be talking about degrowth in a settler state, and in particular focusing on the case in Canada. But before starting, it's important to make some acknowledgements and thank yous. This work is not just my own. This was a big team effort. So my co-authors Kelly Gingrich, Anna Stratton, and Elaine Howarth. We then worked on this together. Kelly's the first author, and I'm very happy to see that she's joining us today. Perhaps she should be doing the presentation rather than me. And just a little bit of I like telling this story, even though it's a little bit of a tangent, because I'm very happy and sort of, yeah, very proud of how this process went. So Kelly, Anna, and Elaine are three master's students who have basically just finished their Master's in Environmental Studies program at York. They have successfully defended their final project, and they reached out to me early in 2023, last year, saying that they'd like to talk more about degrowth. And we set up an independently directed study course, and basically we read all sorts of things around degrowth together. And this sort of organically evolved into all sorts of things, including Kelly, Anna, and Elaine doing a presentation at the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. Eventually, also, we wrote this paper that I'm going to be talking about, and then we organized the seminar series around degrowth as well, which I'll tell you more about later. There's a really nice organic process working in partnership. So I'm very proud of this work and how it originated, and the sort of working relationship within that. So yeah, and now I'm happy to say that Kelly is pursuing a PhD. So do keep an eye out for the work that's going to be coming out of Kelly's research, which I'm sure will be excellent. And also thank you to John for inviting me for the session today. Okay. The idea today is to talk about this paper, which we have submitted to Ecological Economics, and it was accepted with some revisions, which we're basically finishing this week. So hopefully you'll be able to see this paper on paper fairly soon. Fingers crossed the reviewers like our replies. So yeah, we'll start with a bit of why ecological economics, what degrowth is and isn't, and then what about settler states, and then going into the depths of degrowth in settler states. Okay, so I think the first two parts, why ecological economics and degrowth, and what degrowth is and isn't, is perhaps not so necessary for this audience, but I'm still going to go through it. I'll do it fairly quickly because I think it's important to be on the same page about these things. So first of all, this is kind of my favorite graph around climate change in terms of highlighting the seriousness of the situation. I'm trying to find here the little button where I can highlight things on the thing. Just 1 second. I can't see it. Can you see my mouse or not really?
Yes, can see your mouse.
Okay, great. So the idea here is looking at differences in temperature and millions of years before the present here on the right-hand side. And the important thing is to note that in terms of temperature variations, we're reaching a point where we're surpassing any variation that was experienced by humans when there was agriculture and civilization. Yes, we have seen periods of time where it has been colder. We have seen periods of times where it has been hotter. But during those periods of time, there was nothing resembling agriculture and civilization. So the impacts of climate change are, in essence, rewinding the geological clock on Earth, and there hasn't been a time where we have experienced temperatures such as the ones that we're experiencing around here, temperature variations, where there has been anything like what we understand as humanity nowadays. Yes, there was Homo sapiens. Yes, there was homogeneous, but nothing like we understand as living in society these days. So the consequences are really quite serious. Now, why is ecological economics important in all of this? I'm sure you have all seen this. It's because it's got a fundamentally different pre-analytic vision of understanding the relationship between humanity and the economy and the environment. So ecological economics sees the environment as the thing where we're embedded within that and we depend upon it, whilst neoclassical economics sees it just as a subsystem of the economy. So it's a fundamentally different view. And what's behind that view is an understanding in ecological economics of the Earth as a thermodynamic system that is open to energy, because we get solar energy and radiation from the sun, and we expel, we radiate it back, some of it. But it's a closed system in terms of matter. So this very important thermodynamic and biophysical understanding of the Earth system is what's behind that ecological economics pre-analytic vision. And those visions are important because they allow us to, those understandings will allow us to determine certain flaws in the thinking that we might otherwise not be aware of. So neoclassical economics doesn't understand or doesn't give enough importance to this understanding of the Earth as a thermodynamic system. Therefore, they can design a machine like this one, which is the Newland-Phillips machine in the business school at the University of Leeds, and is representing the circular flow of the economy. So you have a model of monetary flows as well as the goods and services of an economy. So they're all flowing through these pipes. And the idea was to model how changes in, for instance, interest rates or things like that would affect different parts of the economy. But at no point any of these flows considers energy or natural resources. The irony in all of this is that for this machine to work, it needs electricity. So even for the model to work and the machine to work, it needs electricity. But still, energy and natural resources are not part of modeling the economy. And then where does degrowth come in all of this is through the basic understanding that infinite growth is not possible within a closed thermodynamic system, and with a limited within a biophysical system that has boundaries. So if we look here on the left-hand side, this is the circular flow, the same circular flow represented by this machine. Because it's a circular flow and there's no outside inputs or outputs to it, it's a system that can keep growing infinitely, and resources just circle round and round and round, and there's no limits to it at all. When you understand the economy as embedded within society and within the Earth, you can see that this inner circle of the economy cannot grow. It's already bounded by society and biophysical planetary boundaries. So that's why we're looking at that's why it's important to look at ecological economics, why it's important to look at degrowth in the current context of climate change. That's why that lens. But at the same time, in order to understand our economic relations, it's not only about that lens. There's many different ways of looking at the problem of economics and the problem of our economic relations. So I think economic pluralism is very important, and I'm very happy to see that this trend of more pluralism in economics thinking and teaching seems to be extending all over the place, including at York University, where there's been a chapter of rethinking economics established at the university. It's the second one in Canada, and now it has been established at the university, involving students from the economics department, and with a lot of involvement from environmental sciences, but also from other areas of the university. So yeah, economic pluralism, really important. Now, what is degrowth? So this is my favorite definition of degrowth, as a planned reduction of energy and resource throughput designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. It's a definition by Jason Hickman. So a couple of, why highlight those words there? So important is to say that it's a planned reduction. So degrowth is not a recession. It's a planned reduction. Also of the reduction is of energy and resource throughput. And that's an important distinction to make. It's not a reduction in, the focus is not on money and monetary terms, and the focus is not necessarily a reduction on GDP, but because we know that the link is so strong between energy and resources and GDP, of course, degrowth is very likely to involve a reduction on GDP. But the focus is not on that. The focus is on a reduction in energy and resource throughput, which very likely will lead to a reduction in GDP. But that's another consideration. And then designed to bring the economy back into balance within the living world. So bring the economy back into this pre-analytic vision of ecological economics, bring the economy within our environmental limits and planetary boundaries in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. And that this is really important. Reducing inequality and improving well-being is important because it means that it's directly related to redistribution. So yes, within this reduction of inequality and improving well-being, there will be reductions in some areas of the economy, particularly harmful areas, particularly areas that bring us out of balance with the living world. But there will be increases in other areas. In which areas? Areas that improve human well-being. So it's a rebalancing and a recalibration and a redistribution. So in terms of what degrowth is and isn't, I think it's really important to highlight that it involves this reduction, but it's also a redistribution. And highlighting this is important because one of the main, let's say, strawman criticisms of degrowth is that it's a reduction in everything. And what about countries in the global south? And what about the case of renewables? Do those have to reduce as well? And it's like, well, of course not. That redistribution aspect means that degrowth is compatible with both a reduction in resource use by those that have too much, but also an increase in resource use by those who do not have enough. So it's, both things can be true at the same time. Yes, it's a reduction in energy and material throughput, but it's also compatible with increases in certain areas. So that redistribution is between those that have too much and those that do not have enough, but also in terms of what the definition here says, right? A reduction in things that take us out of balance with the living world towards things that improve human well-being. So both of those things can be true within degrowth. Okay, so now going into the actual purpose of the paper today. Degrowth, particularly in settler states, how does that look like? Now, I was trying to look for a map. When we think about settler states, Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand are the obvious ones that come to mind. But what does it actually, how do we define a settler state? And I found this map, which I thought was fairly interesting. And it's not so easy to think about what is exactly a settler state or not. I was thinking of the case of my own country here in Colombia, and I've been having discussions with some friends and colleagues. So, one definition of settler states could be states that are sovereign, which were colonized by migrant settlers whose descendants remain politically dominant over the indigenous peoples. So, it's really tricky, for example, in the case of Latin America, and I can see my colleague here, Patricio, is from Chile. You know, do we consider Chile and Colombia and all other Latin American countries as settler states still? I mean, yeah, it's the history of colonialism is much recent in the cases of the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and therefore it seems more obvious. It's more obviously and more visibly and more in yeah. But at which point can we say that in Latin America the descendants of the Spaniards are still politically dominant? At what point do those descendants become yeah, I don't know. So in the case of Bolivia here, as a decolonizing settler state, is because of Evo Morales and the whole movement there. Anyway, but that's not the point of this. This is I'm going off on a tangent again, so apologies for that. But I think it's an interesting question to think about. So, degrowthing a settler state. The way we went about trying to answer this question was first a very broad literature review of degrowth, and then specifically we looked at 3 documents. One of those 3 documents was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was a vote on the 13th of September in 2007. 144 countries voted in favor, 11 countries abstained. And here I think it's interesting that Colombia abstained. It was then signed a couple of years later. But very, very interesting is that 4 of the key states that we consider settler states these days voted against. So Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. Canada finally signed it in 2011. But it's very, very telling that those 4 voted against it. We also looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC in Canada, and we looked at the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, as you all know, was adopted by 196 countries in 2015. It's legally binding to try to limit emissions to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts for below 1.5 and to achieve net zero between 2050 and 2100. But it also says that there needs to be economic support from global north to global south countries. The TRC in Canada was a commission established in 2007 after the residential school settlement agreement. And the goal was to facilitate reconciliation among former students of these residential schools, their families, their communities, and all Canadians. So this commission traveled for 6 years, interviewing and bearing witness to the stories of victims and survivors and their loved ones. I think it was a very difficult process for the commission itself, but then once the report was published for all of Canada. And in 2015, the TRC published its report, which included 94 calls to action. So the documents that we looked at were UNDRIP, the Paris Agreement, and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The idea in this paper is that we're trying to look at this intersection that we're facing right now, a deep ecological crisis and the need for reconciliation with indigenous people, looking at that with hope. We see that, particularly in the case of Canada, it might be reaching a point politically and popularly where confronting both of these things might become an opportunity. Now, if that is the case, then we want to see how degrowth aligns or not with pursuing those two objectives at the same time. Here I want to say that the TRC defines reconciliation as establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country, meaning Canada. But achieving that requires an understanding of past injustices, recognition of harm, steps towards atonement, and a commitment to meaningful change in behavior. So the TRC's definition of reconciliation is, if taken kind of in its broad meaning, it's more than ticking off different actions in the calls to action. It involves a true meaningful change. Okay, so by looking at these documents, thinking about degrowth, we saw three thematic alignments between degrowth and reconciliation, more broadly understood. So it's a thematic alignment around ecological limits and Indigenous territories, another one around autonomy and Indigenous sovereignty, and another one around, well-being and Indigenous conceptions of well-being. Well, let's go through these one at a time. So reconciliation, again, broadly understood, when you see it conceptualized ontologically by Indigenous people, that's very distinct from state-conceived and sponsored frameworks such as the CTAs. So that requires reconciliation beyond the human dimension. So it's a reconciliation that it's beyond the relationships between the state and the Indigenous communities, but also to include relationships with the earth and all living beings. This, of course, is rooted in Indigenous worldviews that are very much tied in terms of relations between humans and non-humans, and that link between Indigenous peoples and their environment. And what is interesting here in terms of this thematic alignment is that some currents of degrowth consider also a deeper epistemological element of respecting the ecosystems we live in and we live with. So there is an alignment there. So what we're trying to say here in terms of this thematic alignment is not that reconciliation, in terms of fulfilling the calls to action, it's not saying that reconciliation must involve degrowth, because when you look at the calls to action, it doesn't say at any point the word degrowth, obviously. It doesn't call for reduction in material and energy throughput or any of these sorts of things. And we're not saying that reconciliation must involve degrowth. What we're saying is that by degrowth engaging in these discussions of reconciliation, there's actually quite a lot of alignment. So reconciliation there is no contradictions in it. Reconciliation can, and more importantly, normatively, we say it ought to involve degrowth to be true, meaningful and true reconciliation. So again, the invitation here is for degrowth scholars to engage in these conversations of what does reconciliation mean in a broad sense, and how can degrowth become an ally to Indigenous struggles in Canada and elsewhere. So, for instance, degrowing Canada's fossil fuel reliant economy is necessary for the health of the land, and supports the redistribution of power away from the state and towards community, which is in itself an anti-colonial movement, an anti-colonial move in a place in Canada. So, in those sorts of ways, degrowth can become an allied force for these sorts of calls for true reconciliation. The second thematic analysis is between autonomy and indigenous sovereignty. So as many of you will know here, Degrowth advocates for strong autonomy of communities and self-reliance and bottom-up initiatives and all those sorts of things. So there is a strong resonance between Degrowth's call for local autonomy and the imperative of honoring indigenous sovereignty on Turtle Island as it's described by some of these indigenous origin stories. So there's an obvious and fairly strong alignment there. However, what is interesting here is that this is a question that we don't quite answer in the paper, is what does local autonomy for settler and newcomers communities look like when that local autonomy is usually happening on indigenous land, often unceded indigenous land? And how can perhaps a degrowth push towards local autonomy could reproduce colonial relations? So that tension there between promoting autonomy within settler and newcomer communities, but you know, how to do that when there might be tensions with indigenous autonomy as well. So yeah, this is although there is a clear alignment, I think there is a little bit of a tension there as well, and this tension does, as far as we know, hasn't been considered in the degrowth literature. So it's again an invitation to engage more in it. And then the final thematic analysis is around indigenous worldviews, such as all of the ones mentioned here. Some of them by indigenous communities in Canada or North America, and some of them by indigenous communities elsewhere. They all have quite a strong overlap with a degrowth understanding of well-being, and that is a degrowth understanding of well-being is around flourishing, around needs, and not wants. It is a degrowth understanding of well-being goes beyond utility maximization and increasing income to be able to maximize your utility through increased consumption. So it moves beyond that very individualistic view of well-being that in turn justifies increases in GDP towards a much different understanding of well-being, more, let's say, more holistic one that's considering human flourishing in relation to the social and environmental contexts. Okay, so this is just a summary of degrowth and reconciliation alignments. So how there's evidence of, from these articles, from the calls to actions, the UNDRIP articles and the Paris Agreement. This is kind of where we're getting the evidence that this alignment exists. You can go and look at the calls to actions themselves or at the UNDRIP articles. The Paris Agreement in itself was interesting because we only found one article that made reference to autonomy and perhaps conceptions of the good life. So when it's talking about traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. So the Paris Agreement was interesting in terms of its lack of reference to these things and perhaps a missed opportunity there. So a couple of broad conclusions. One, that there's an urgent need to uphold those principles of UNDRIP and the calls to action, and to respect the sovereignty of indigenous peoples to truly address the climate emergency, to be able to pursue these two objectives together. And the the goal that we have here to engage the degrowth scholarship more with indigenous sovereignties and questions of what degrowth might look like in settler states, and for degrowth scholars to work alongside indigenous communities in determining what a transition might look like for them. So degrowth scholars and the invitation here is to work alongside indigenous communities and become allies in that sense. Okay, I'd like to leave some time for discussion. So just to close, this is the seminar series that I mentioned at the beginning. It's already finished, but again, Kelly, Anna, and Elaine were a big part of this. If you'd like to hear more about degrowth, there's 6 sessions there, and you can look back at the recordings. So yeah, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. It's very interesting. We have a question in the chat, but I'll let Alejandro unmute himself and he can ask it himself. Alejandro? Not unmuting.
Okay, well,
I'll read it so everybody can, just in case. He's asking, if the focus isn't on reducing GDP, how would you compare degrowth to the so-called inclusive growth?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things make those two very different. One is that degrowth really rejects GDP as a meaningful measure of let's say development or progress, or whatever word you want to use. So degrowth would want to move away from GDP as an indicator of anything really. GDP simply measures the annual production of goods and services within a particular country. Whilst inclusive growth would still want to measure GDP and would still want that to grow. And the other way that it's different is that if we're reducing energy and material throughput, the likelihood is that GDP is going to go down, whilst inclusive growth would still want to be increasing that GDP. And because what was it? I had a point there, but it's escaped me. Yeah, I think well, the main difference would be the focus wouldn't be on that. Yeah, Kelly is helping me here with a much better answer. Yeah, the point about decoupling is a really important one. Inclusive growth. So yes, thank you, Kelly, for this. Inclusive growth cannot make sense unless we accept that decoupling and absolute decoupling is possible. However, evidence for that is always very, very contested, and it's not clear at all. Sometimes you find localized evidence of decoupling, but not at a broader scale or at a global scale. And sometimes you find evidence of decoupling against one particular indicator, but not against other environmental indicators. So the premise of inclusive growth is really sustained on the pillar of decoupling being possible, and that is not clear at all. And degrowth is very much recognizes the limitations of decoupling.
Are there any other questions or comments? You can either raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I might have a question about, unrelated to the talk in some ways, whether there's lessons to be drawn from states that are decolonizing, as you showed in your image, for, I guess, degrowth or changing the relationship to nature.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. Thank you. I think there are lessons to learn there. I think in the case of Bolivia, there's been some really interesting examples. If we take Bolivia, let's say as a bit of a decolonizing case, um, gains made around rights of nature seem relevant and seem like a really important lesson to learn. There has been um, some important gains in that sense in Canada as well. Yeah, that's sort of the first one that comes to mind. Um, I think other lessons to learn are also around the challenges of decolonization and how really it's encountered with lots of barriers. So even if the efforts are there, um, colonial and capitalist systems are really embedded in institutions, and they become quite difficult to overcome. So the case of South Africa as perhaps another relevant example comes to mind, where yes, they managed to overcome apartheid, but still the economic and social divisions are still very entrenched. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
There's a comment in the chat. Reconciliation will likely involve redistribution. It seems to me that the challenge remains how to do this within a fixed size or shrinking economy. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge challenge. But what redistribution means is that some people, some sectors of society will have to lose uh, something, right? So if it's a fixed or shrinking economy, um, it means some people have to give some things up, and that's why it's so difficult, because no one really wants to give up what they have. However, I think the arguments around and that alignment with well-being, I think it's an interesting area to explore, because I think even sectors of society that would have to give up something. I mean, the reason why I think that's an important factor to explore is because overconsumption and excess are not necessarily conducive to well-being. So there might be arguments and things to say in that way, to try and surpass that challenge. I'm not saying it'd be easy. I think it's a huge challenge, but we are already seeing little things like, I don't know, certain groups of very wealthy people advocating for higher taxation systems, or actually being in favor of a global corporate taxation system, because they managed to recognize that, I'm not saying these are perfect in any way, right? But they've managed to recognize that inequality is bad for everyone, not only for the ones at the bottom of the distribution, but for the ones at the top as well. Right? This is the work of what are they called? Kate. Anyway, the book, The Spirit Level, as in the spirit level that tells you how straight or how tilted something is. Kate, oh my god, is this gonna bug me now? Anyway, yeah, that this inequality is bad for everyone. If we manage to make the case along that, maybe redistribution wouldn't be as hard, as strongly opposed, but maybe I'm just being naive and too hopeful. But I think the arguments around that could be useful.
There's another question by Paula. Could you expand further on degrowth and the limitation of decoupling?
Yeah, so there's two types of decoupling. There's absolute decoupling and relative decoupling. So relative decoupling is when when GDP goes up and environmental impacts go up still, but at a lower rate. So go up but slower. And that's what we're seeing in most countries. And then there is absolute decoupling, where GDP goes up or economic activity goes up, but the environmental impacts actually go down, reduce. So what we're seeing right now at a global level is that the emissions intensities of economies, the CO2 intensities, and all these sorts of things are decoupling a little bit from economic activity, because we're doing technological improvements and renewables and all these sorts of things, but they're not going down. So we're having a situation of relative decoupling, but not absolute decoupling. And that is problematic because in CO2 terms, we have a carbon budget. So even if emissions are going at a slower rate, and yes, that is progress and that is something to be happy about, they're still going up. So they're still eating our carbon budget, and they're not getting us closer to net zero. So degrowth would argue that, if you imagine you've got a pie of, I don't know, energy demand, and that pie keeps growing and growing and growing. So yes, your renewable sector can be growing as well, but it's only meeting the increased demand. It's very, very difficult to achieve absolute decoupling when the pie keeps growing. Much easier, and in fact, a recent systematic review which found evidence of actually absolute decoupling in a handful of countries, they found that it happened in countries that had shown not a little bit of a recession or very, very low GDP growth of 0 point something or 1% GDP growth or something like that. So decoupling is really difficult. Absolute decoupling, I mean, it's very difficult to happen and to find evidence for it when GDP keeps expanding at high rates.
There's another question. I'm sharing this space. Okay. They were wondering whether you interacted with Indigenous communities in Canada as part of the piece of research or otherwise, either through personal ties or through engagement, and they'd be very interested in hearing how this is perceived outside of references in legislative texts.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. That's a really important question. No, we didn't engage with Indigenous communities. We wanted to write this text from the perspective, also recognizing that we ourselves are all kind of white settlers in Canada right now. So recognizing our positionality there, our idea wasn't to sort of go to Indigenous communities and say, look, this is what degrowth says, and isn't it wonderful? On the contrary, it's more to say, look, degrowth communities, activists, scholars, these are the sorts of struggles that Indigenous communities are going through. This is what in legislative texts they've managed to achieve. How can we align degrowth to help goals of reconciliation, of autonomy, of different conceptions of well-being, right? So it's sort of a flipped perspective. Do you know what I mean? It's not, do Indigenous struggles align with degrowth is, how can degrowth help here? And how can we become allies? Now, whether Indigenous communities would want even this kind of I don't know, let's say help or alignment or whatever, we don't know. We haven't taken that step yet. This was just a very initial exploration. But that was the perspective we were coming from.
Are there any other questions or comments? Not seeing any. So with that, I just want to thank you very much for today's seminar. It was extremely interesting and a lot of things to think about. So, a question. Where will the paper be published?
Well, we're crossing our fingers in ecological economics soon. We hope soon. We're submitting the revised version next week. John, would you mind if I just again say thank you also to my co-authors that are here, Kelly and Elaine. Kelly and Elaine, if you can, if you want to put your cameras on, that'd be great, so that people get to know you and can look out for your work as well. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, thank you for that, John. Yeah.
No, well, thank you again so much, and we hope to see everybody again on October 4th for our next seminar with Jeroen Vandenberg. So we will have this recording up within a few days on the YouTube page if you would like to see it again for more information. So, well, thank you again, and goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Lina.
Thank you, John.